Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
Nobody talks about the moment he changes. Not the loud version. Not the dramatic movie scene. Not the "I finally understand everything now" speech. I mean the quiet shift. The strange overnight change that happens after one tiny moment he can't shake. Sometimes it's after she leaves his apartment and the room suddenly feels wrong. Sometimes it's hearing her say one sentence too honestly. Sometimes it's watching her stop chasing him. And sometimes, honestly, nothing even happened externally. He just wakes up one morning feeling emotionally cornered by something he can't explain. And the weird part is, from the outside, he often looks colder after it happens. More distant, more avoidant, more confusing. But internally, his entire nervous system is reacting to something his ego is still trying to deny. And that's the part people misunderstand. Because the overnight change usually doesn't look like love at first. Sometimes it looks like withdrawal. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like him cleaning his entire kitchen at 2 a.m. because if he sits still for 5 minutes, he'll have to admit she got under his skin. This isn't a story about a perfect man suddenly becoming emotionally awakened. It's about what actually happens when someone who spent years emotionally surviving suddenly feels something real enough to disrupt the system he built to protect himself. And honestly, some men don't handle that beautifully. Some of them disappear. Some get colder before they soften. Some pretend not to care while checking her profile 3 times a night. Some say they need space, then stare at their phone hoping she texts first. This is about that version. The human version. The embarrassing version. The version nobody admits out loud. The strange thing is, the moment that changes him usually doesn't look important while it's happening. There's no dramatic music, no cinematic confession, no visible emotional collapse. Most of the time, it's something stupidly small. A sentence, a pause, the way she looks at him for half a second too long. That's what people don't understand. The real emotional triggers are rarely loud when they arrive. Sometimes they enter the body quietly. And honestly, that's probably why they're so dangerous. Because if the moment looked obviously life-changing, he would have protected himself from it sooner. But instead, it slips past the defenses, almost unnoticed. Like that night he was standing in the kitchen pretending to help clean up after dinner. Not really cleaning, just moving things around. Rinsing the same glass twice, opening cabinets without putting anything away, checking his phone even though no notifications came in. She was talking about something ordinary, work maybe, or her sister. He barely remembers the topic now, but he remembers one moment with uncomfortable clarity. She laughed, then looked at him differently after, not flirtatiously, worse, softly, like she saw something in him he hadn't even admitted to himself yet. And he felt it immediately, not emotionally at first, physically, that weird tight feeling in the chest that men spend years pretending is stress. That sudden urge to create movement, to grab his phone, to make a joke, to break eye contact, to say literally anything that returns the moment back to normal. Because something about being truly seen feels strangely dangerous when you've spent your whole life surviving through emotional control. And that's the part he wouldn't admit out loud. Not even to himself. Especially not to himself. So instead, he smirked a little, made some sarcastic comment, turned away, opened the refrigerator for absolutely no reason. Just movement. Men do that a lot actually. Movement instead of feeling. You can almost watch the nervous system trying to escape intimacy in real time. And the strange part is, sometimes he doesn't even realize he's doing it. He just suddenly feels restless, like his body wants out before his mind understands why. And later that night, after she leaves, he tells himself nothing happened. Because technically nothing did happen. No confession. No relationship talk. No emotional scene. She just touched his arm lightly while walking past him and said, "You don't always have to act like you're okay." That was it. One sentence. One tiny sentence most people would forget within minutes. But something about it followed him home. And he hated that. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was accurate. There's a specific kind of discomfort that happens when someone accidentally tells the truth about you in a calm voice. Especially when they weren't trying to expose you. She said it gently, which somehow made it worse. Because now he couldn't even turn her into the villain to escape the feeling. So he does what emotionally overwhelmed people often do. He minimizes it. He distracts himself. He goes home and turns the TV on to loud, scrolls aimlessly through social media without absorbing anything, checks her profile once, then immediately feels annoyed at himself for checking. Relax. It's not that deep. But his body already knows something shifted. That's the uncomfortable reality nobody explains properly. The emotional trigger usually reaches the nervous system before the ego creates a story for it. Which is why men often become confusing after moments of real emotional intimacy. Because internally, something activated. But consciously, he's still trying to behave like everything is casual. And the contradiction between those two states creates chaos. So now he starts acting slightly different without understanding why. Nothing obvious yet. Just subtle things. He replays small moments during random parts of the day. Like while driving. Especially while driving. There's something about being alone in a car at night that removes the distractions enough for suppressed feelings to crawl back up. And suddenly he's remembering tiny details he didn't even realize he noticed. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear while listening. The pause before she answered certain questions. The look on her face when he avoided eye contact too long. And he starts having these strange unfinished thoughts. Not full realizations. Just fragments. Like, why did that bother me? Or worse, why did that matter to me? And immediately another voice answers. It doesn't. Too fast. Almost defensive. Then silence. Then the memory returns anyway. That's usually how it begins. Not with clarity. With repetition. The mind replaying something emotionally unresolved over and over until the body finally admits. This landed somewhere deeper than expected. But outwardly, he may actually become more distant after the trigger happens. That confuses people, because they think emotional impact should immediately create emotional openness. Usually it doesn't. Sometimes the first reaction to deep emotional activation is withdrawal, especially for men who learned early in life that vulnerability creates instability. So now he's texting slightly differently. Not less interested exactly, just more careful, more controlled. Longer pauses between replies, more dry humor, less emotional transparency after moments of closeness. And part of him notices he's doing it. That's the weird thing. He's not completely unconscious. Sometimes he catches himself mid-avoidance, mid-withdrawal, mid-performance, like typing a genuine message, then deleting it because it suddenly feels too exposed. Or opening her chat just to stare at the screen without sending anything. And honestly, some of the behaviors become embarrassingly human at this stage. He checks if she viewed his story. pretends not to care, checks again 10 minutes later. He tells himself he needs space, then feels weird when she actually gives it to him. He misses her attention while simultaneously feeling overwhelmed by it. Contradiction everywhere. And underneath all of it is one uncomfortable truth. The trigger wasn't really about her. Not entirely. She just accidentally touched the part of him he works hardest to avoid. That's why the moment stays. That's why it keeps replaying. Because emotionally significant moments are rarely about the actual sentence being said. They're about what the sentence exposes. And sometimes she exposes something without even realizing it. Like his loneliness. Or how exhausted he is from pretending to be emotionally unaffected all the time. Or how deeply he wants intimacy while simultaneously fearing what intimacy demands from him. That's why he changes afterward. Not overnight exactly, even though it looks overnight from the outside. Internally, it's more like emotional static building slowly behind the walls. And sometimes he starts reacting in strange little ways before he fully understands why. Cleaning the apartment at midnight. Going to the gym angry for no clear reason. Suddenly unable to focus on conversations. Staring at old messages longer than necessary. Trying to return to emotional control. Trying to become the version of himself that existed before the trigger. But once someone makes you feel emotionally seen in a real way, something becomes harder to unfeel after that. Even if you avoid them, even if you withdraw, even if you say nothing. And honestly, that's usually the moment he starts becoming confusing. Not because he's playing games intentionally. Sometimes he genuinely does not understand what's happening inside him yet. He just knows something feels different now. More exposed. More emotionally dangerous. And instead of moving toward the feeling, he circles around it. Avoids eye contact longer. Becomes quieter after intimacy. Acts emotionally casual in moments that are clearly not casual. Because part of him already knows. If he fully admits how deeply the moment affected him, he may not be able to go back to emotional detachment afterward. And for someone who built their identity around staying emotionally controlled, that realization can feel terrifyingly personal. So he tells himself it's nothing. Again and again. Meanwhile, his body keeps replaying her voice anyway. You don't always have to act like you're okay. That sentence follows him for weeks. Not because it was poetic. Because it was specific. Because somewhere deep down, he knows he's been acting for a very long time. The strange part is, he usually starts changing before he understands what's actually happening to him. That's why his behavior becomes so confusing. Not just to her, to himself too. Because consciously, he still thinks he's fine. Still thinks he's in control. Still thinks this is casual. Still thinks he can manage the feeling by reducing contact slightly and getting his head straight. But underneath that performance, his nervous system is already reacting to emotional exposure. And once that starts happening, the behavior changes first. Awareness comes later. That's why after certain emotional moments, men sometimes become inconsistent almost overnight. Not intentionally manipulative all the time. Sometimes just internally split. Part of him wants more connection now. Another part is already searching for emotional exits. And both parts are operating simultaneously. That contradiction creates weird behavior, like replying slower, while staring at the phone more often. That contradiction is important, because people assume distance means lack of feeling. Sometimes distance is actually emotional overload wearing a colder face. And honestly, he doesn't always recognize that in real time. He just suddenly feels strange, restless, mentally noisy, emotionally exposed in ways he can't organize properly. So now little things start shifting. Nothing dramatic enough for him to fully confront yet. Just subtle changes in rhythm. He still texts her, but the energy changes. Before, messages felt easy, automatic. Now he rereads them before sending, deletes things, rewrites them shorter. A message that originally said, "I actually miss talking to you tonight," suddenly becomes, "Hope your night's going good." Less risk, less exposure, less truth. And she notices. Of course she notices. Women notice emotional temperature changes almost immediately, especially when intimacy existed before the withdrawal. That's what makes this stage painful, because externally, it starts looking like emotional disinterest. But internally, he may actually be thinking about her more than before, just with more anxiety attached to it now. That's the part nobody explains correctly. Once real emotional intimacy enters the dynamic, the feeling itself can start activating fear alongside desire. So now closeness no longer feels purely exciting. It also feels dangerous. Dangerous to his independence. Dangerous to emotional control. Dangerous to the carefully maintained image he has of himself. Especially if he's spent years identifying as the unaffected one. And you can almost watch the emotional conflict leak into everyday behavior. He starts taking longer to answer emotionally direct questions. Not because he has no feelings, because the feelings suddenly feel too visible, like she can see through him now. And that creates vulnerability he hasn't prepared for. So he compensates. Sometimes with logic. Men do that a lot when emotions become overwhelming. They suddenly become hyper-practical, hyper-rational, as if organizing the emotional experience intellectually will stop them from feeling exposed by it. So now conversations sound different. Less softness, more analysis. She says, "You've been distant lately." And instead of answering emotionally, he says something like, "I've just been busy, technically possible, emotionally incomplete." And both people in the conversation know it. That's the uncomfortable thing about emotional avoidance. Most of the time, the avoidant person knows they're not fully telling the truth either. They just don't know how to say the real thing without feeling emotionally unsafe. So now, he starts hiding inside smaller versions of honesty. "I'm tired. I've had a lot going on. I just need some space." And maybe part of that is even true. But underneath it is another truth he can barely admit to himself yet. This connection started affecting him more deeply than he expected. And instead of leaning toward that feeling, he starts managing it. Reducing intensity, reducing vulnerability, reducing emotional visibility. Like turning down the volume on something internally loud. But suppression has side effects. That's why he becomes emotionally inconsistent during this stage. One day he feels warm, open, engaged. The next day he goes emotionally flat for no obvious reason. And honestly, sometimes he hates himself while he's doing it. That's the ugly part nobody romanticizes properly. Because occasionally he can feel himself pulling away in real time and still not fully stop it. Like standing outside his own behavior watching it happen. Watching himself delay replying even though he already saw the message. Watching himself act emotionally casual when he actually wants reassurance. Watching himself become quieter after moments of intimacy. Especially after intimacy. That shift happens a lot. People don't talk about that enough. Sometimes the emotional trigger deepens after closeness, not before it. Because intimacy removes distraction. Now, he's alone, afterward replaying details he wasn't supposed to care about this much. The way she touched his face absent-mindedly. The way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. The softness in her voice right before falling asleep. And suddenly something that was supposed to feel temporary starts feeling emotionally real. That's usually when panic quietly enters. Not dramatic panic. Functional panic. The kind where he still goes to work. Still answers emails. Still jokes with friends. But internally something feels unstable now. Like emotional gravity increased overnight. And the strange thing is, sometimes he reacts to that instability by becoming colder externally, not warmer. Because warmth now carries emotional consequences. So he starts protecting himself in subtle ways. Less eye contact during vulnerable conversations. More joking during emotional moments. More disappearing into work. And sometimes the distractions become almost embarrassingly obvious. Suddenly he's obsessed with the gym again. Cleaning the apartment aggressively at midnight. Starting random projects he doesn't even care about. Movement. Again. Movement instead of feeling. Because stillness becomes dangerous once the emotions catch up. And late at night is usually the worst part. Especially after everyone stops texting. After the noise dies down. After there's nothing left to distract him from his own mind. That's when the internal conversations start. The unfinished ones. The emotionally awkward ones. Why am I reacting like this? You know why. No, I don't. Yes, you do. And immediately he grabs the phone again. Checks her profile. Puts the phone down. Picks it back up 30 seconds later. Not even necessarily looking for anything specific. Just trying to feel connected without risking actual vulnerability. That's what emotionally overwhelmed people do sometimes. They create proximity without exposure. Watching stories instead of initiating conversation. Liking things instead of expressing feelings. Hovering emotionally nearby without stepping fully into honesty. Because honesty now feels terrifyingly irreversible. If he admits this matters, then he loses the illusion of emotional detachment. And some men build their entire identity around that illusion. So instead, he becomes confusing, even to himself. One minute he misses her intensely. The next minute he wants distance so badly he almost resents her for existing inside his head this much. That contradiction creates shame too, especially masculine shame. Because many men were never taught how to experience emotional dependence without feeling weak for it. So now he starts judging himself while simultaneously craving connection. Why am I thinking about her this much? Get it together. It's not even serious. But the body rarely listens to ego once attachment starts deepening. That's why the behaviors become so irrational. He says he needs space, then feels disappointed when she stops reaching out. He wants emotional closeness, then shuts down the second she gets too emotionally near. He misses her, then intentionally delays answering her texts. Contradiction everywhere. And honestly, some of his behavior during this phase can look immature. Because it is immature sometimes. Emotionally overwhelmed people are not always graceful. Sometimes they avoid. Sometimes they self-protect badly. Sometimes they create confusion, because confusion temporarily gives them distance from vulnerability. And the hardest part is, part of him knows she can feel the shift happening. He notices her becoming slightly more careful too. More uncertain. Less relaxed. And instead of calming him down, that awareness pressures him more. Because now there's emotional responsibility attached to his behavior. Now the connection feels real enough to hurt someone. And that realization forces him into a confrontation he's avoided for years. He can no longer participate halfway emotionally without consequences. That's the real trigger underneath all of this. Not love exactly. Responsibility. Emotional exposure. The possibility of being known deeply enough that his usual escape routes stop working. And for someone emotionally avoidant, that realization can feel almost claustrophobic, even if he genuinely cares. Especially if he genuinely cares. So now he starts drifting internally between two desires. I want this, and I need to regain control of myself. And unfortunately, during this stage, control often wins temporarily, not because the feeling disappears, because the feeling became too real to manage comfortably. That's why he changes before he understands himself. That's why the energy shifts before the words arrive. That's why she feels him pulling away emotionally before he fully understands what he's even running from. Because deep down, he already knows this connection is starting to reach places inside him that can no longer stay emotionally untouched. The body usually figures it out first. That's the uncomfortable part. Not the mind. Not the carefully constructed explanations. Not the emotionally detached version of him that keeps insisting everything is fine. The body. The nervous system notices long before the ego is ready to cooperate. Which is why this stage becomes so confusing. Because now he's reacting emotionally in physical ways he can't fully explain yet. And honestly, it annoys him. At first, he tries to ignore it. Tries to continue life normally. Work, gym, phone calls, errands, conversations that require half attention. But something feels slightly off now. Not dramatic enough to collapse his life. Just enough to interrupt his internal rhythm. Like his body lost the ability to fully relax. And it shows up in strange little ways first. Sleep changes. Not instantly. Gradually. He starts waking up in the middle of the night for no reason. Or reaching for his phone half awake. Or having dreams that feel emotionally loaded even when he barely remembers them afterward. Sometimes it's not even dreams about her specifically. Just dreams with the same emotional atmosphere. Longing, pressure, absence, almost saying something, almost staying, almost losing something. He wakes up feeling emotionally crowded and immediately tries to shut it down. Checks emails, gets coffee, turns on music too quickly. Noise. People who are emotionally overwhelmed often create noise immediately after waking up. Silence becomes dangerous once the feelings underneath start surfacing. So now he keeps himself overstimulated. Podcasts in the car, videos playing while cooking, scrolling while watching TV. Anything to avoid sitting inside his own nervous system for too long. But the body keeps leaking truth anyway. That's the thing about emotional suppression. It doesn't disappear. It relocates into sleep patterns, into tension, into restlessness, into compulsive behavior. And suddenly he's becoming aware of her at random moments that make absolutely no logical sense. Like standing in line at a grocery store hearing someone laugh behind him. Not even her laugh exactly. Just similar enough. And his chest reacts before his brain catches up. Tiny drop in the stomach. Instant alertness. A weird flash of hope that disappears half a second later. Then embarrassment. Because now he feels ridiculous. Get a grip. That phrase starts living in his head around this stage. Because he still believes emotional control should be possible if he just disciplines himself harder. So he tries. God, he tries. He distracts himself aggressively. Works later than necessary. Starts answering texts slower on purpose. Goes emotionally flat in conversations where he actually wants warmth. And sometimes the emotional suppression becomes almost physical. like sitting on the edge of the bed staring at the floor, feeling something heavy in his chest, but refusing to name it. Men do that a lot actually. Feel emotions physically before they allow themselves to experience them consciously. Especially grief, especially longing, especially attachment. Because naming the feeling makes it real. And reality means vulnerability. So instead he says things like, "I'm just stressed. I'm tired. I've got a lot on my mind," which is true, but incomplete. Very incomplete. Because what he doesn't say is, her absence started affecting the emotional atmosphere of his entire day. Not constantly. That's what makes it confusing. It arrives in waves. He'll be perfectly fine for hours. Then, suddenly something small pulls her back into his body again. A song, a street, a scent, a sentence someone else says accidentally. And the reaction feels involuntary. That's what unsettles him most. The lack of control. Because now his nervous system is emotionally associating ordinary life with her presence. And that changes things. Suddenly, the coffee shop near his apartment feels different. The drive home feels longer. The silence in the kitchen feels louder. Not because she's physically there, because emotionally, traces of her exist in routines now. And routines are dangerous places for suppressed feelings, especially late at night. Late nights become emotionally revealing during this stage. That's when performance weakens. That's when the masculine role of "I'm good" starts malfunctioning a little. Because there's nobody around to impress at 1:17 a.m. while sitting alone on the couch staring at a phone screen. That's when the truth slips through. Like opening her profile absent-mindedly. Not even intentionally at first. Muscle memory almost. Then staring at her picture longer than necessary. Then immediately locking the phone. Then unlocking it again 30 seconds later. Contradiction. Always contradiction. And part of him knows how unhealthy it looks, which somehow makes him harsher toward himself instead of softer. Because shame enters here too. Not just longing. Shame for caring this much. Shame for feeling emotionally affected. Shame that one person disrupted his emotional balance this deeply. Especially if he spent years convincing himself he didn't need anyone emotionally. That identity starts cracking quietly during this stage. And honestly, the body feels that crack before the mind creates language for it. That's why he becomes emotionally strange. One moment emotionally numb, the next moment deeply reactive. One moment detached, the next moment replaying one conversation for 2 straight hours while driving nowhere specific at night. Sometimes he literally drives longer just to avoid going home and sitting with himself. People do that more than they admit, especially emotionally avoidant men. Movement feels safer than stillness, because stillness forces confrontation, and confrontation means admitting this connection mattered more than expected. So now the body starts protesting every attempt to go back to normal. Flirting feels emptier. Distractions feel shorter. Conversations with other people feel strangely hollow afterward. Not because nobody else is attractive, because emotional comparison quietly started happening. And he hates that too. He hates realizing he's emotionally measuring experiences against her now. That realization feels dangerous, permanent somehow, like crossing an emotional line he can't uncross. So naturally, he tries harder to regain control. And this is where behavior gets especially contradictory. Sometimes he becomes colder exactly because he cares more, which sounds irrational until you understand fear. Because warmth increases attachment. Attachment increases vulnerability. Vulnerability increases emotional risk. And his nervous system interprets risk like danger now. So he pulls back slightly, Not fully disappearing yet. Just emotionally reducing exposure. Less emotional honesty. Less spontaneous affection. More control interactions. But internally, he's becoming more emotionally consumed, not less. That's why the body starts malfunctioning around ordinary moments. Loss of appetite sometimes, or emotional eating, random fatigue, chest tightness, overthinking before sleep, and nobody around him fully notices because externally he still functions. That's important. Emotionally overwhelmed people often look normal from the outside. They still go to work, still laugh, still post things online, still answer "I'm good" automatically. Meanwhile, internally, their nervous system is running emotional marathons in silence. And occasionally the truth slips out accidentally. Tiny moments. Like someone mentioning her name casually and his body reacting too fast before he hides it. Or him seeing a message notification and feeling immediate adrenaline before realizing it's not her. That one hurts more than people admit. That split second of hope. Then the drop afterward. And what's strange is, sometimes he still won't consciously admit he misses her during this stage. He'll phrase it differently. "I just got used to talking to her. It's weird not hearing from her. I'm probably just in my head." Minimizing. Again. Because fully admitting emotional attachment still feels exposing. So instead the body keeps carrying what the ego refuses to say clearly. And eventually exhaustion enters. Emotional exhaustion specifically. Because suppressing feelings takes energy. A lot of energy. That's why he starts looking mentally distant sometimes. Not because he stopped caring. Because his internal world became crowded. Too many unsaid things. Too many unfinished emotions. Too many conversations happening internally that never make it into real life. And the strangest part is, sometimes he starts realizing the body feels calmer when he talks to her again. That realization terrifies him, because now comfort itself becomes emotionally exposing. Now he has to confront something deeply uncomfortable. Her presence regulates parts of him he didn't even realize were dysregulated before. And once someone reaches that layer emotionally, distance stops feeling simple, even if he still acts like it is. So now he's caught between two realities. The ego says, "This isn't a big deal." Meanwhile, the body keeps reacting like loss already entered the room. And somewhere in the middle of that contradiction, he starts understanding something he's not ready to say out loud yet. He is no longer emotionally untouched by this connection. No matter how controlled he tries to appear externally, no matter how casual he tries to sound, his body already knows, even if his pride is still negotiating with the truth. At some point, he decides distance will help. Not dramatically, usually quietly, almost casually. He tells himself he just needs a little space to clear his head, to regain balance, to stop overthinking. And honestly, part of him believes that. Because when emotions start becoming too real for someone emotionally avoidant, distance feels like oxygen at first. Relief. That's the word people rarely admit. The silence initially feels relieving. No pressure to respond carefully. No emotional exposure. No risk of saying too much. No moments where he accidentally reveals how deeply affected he actually is. So for a little while, he feels calmer, or at least less activated. And that temporary relief tricks him into believing withdrawal is working. That's why he pulls away. Not always because he stopped caring. Sometimes because caring started dysregulating him emotionally, and he doesn't yet know how to hold intimacy without feeling consumed by it. So now he creates distance, replies slower, stops initiating, acts emotionally occupied. Sometimes he even convinces himself this is the mature thing to do. I just need to focus on myself. I don't want to complicate things. I need to figure my head out first. And maybe there's truth in that. But underneath those explanations is another truth he avoids saying directly. Being emotionally close to her started making him feel emotionally visible in ways he couldn't control. And visibility terrifies people who survived by emotional self-containment. So now he chooses silence, or partial silence, enough distance to lower the emotional intensity. But what he doesn't expect is how loud the silence becomes afterward. That's the part that catches him off guard. Because the nervous system he was trying to calm suddenly has nothing to distract itself with anymore. No conversations. No small check-ins. No emotional reassurance disguised as casual interaction. Just space. And space sounds peaceful in theory until you're alone inside it long enough. Then suddenly ordinary life starts feeling emotionally hollow in weird little ways. That's how it begins. Not grand heartbreak. Tiny absences. Reaching for the phone before remembering there's nothing new to check. Seeing something funny and instinctively wanting to send it to her. Then stopping halfway through. Those moments hurt more than dramatic endings sometimes. Because they expose attachment in its most unconscious form. Muscle memory. Emotional habit. Presence woven into ordinary routines. And honestly, this is usually where he realizes he was far more emotionally attached than he originally admitted to himself. But instead of admitting that clearly, he becomes restless, emotionally irritated, agitated in ways that don't fully make sense. Because now the silence he wanted starts confronting him with things distraction was protecting him from. Like loneliness. Real loneliness. Not the cinematic version. The quiet version. The version where he walks through the grocery store emotionally numb while staring too long at random shelves. The version where he comes home, tosses his keys on the counter, and immediately turns the TV on just to create noise in the apartment. The version where he lies in bed scrolling mindlessly because being alone with his thoughts suddenly feels unbearable. And what makes this phase emotionally complicated is, part of him still thinks he made the correct decision. That's the contradiction. He misses her, while simultaneously believing distance is necessary. So now his internal dialogue becomes emotionally fragmented. You needed space. I know. So why does this feel worse? I don't know. And the truth is, sometimes emotional avoidance works temporarily. That's why people keep doing it. Distance can reduce activation short-term, but eventually the emotional reality underneath starts surfacing anyway. Especially once the adrenaline of withdrawal wears off. Because eventually silence stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling empty. And emptiness has a way of revealing what mattered. That's when the small behaviors begin. The painfully human ones. Opening her chat, then closing it immediately. Typing, "Hey, been thinking about you." Deleting it. Typing again, "How have you been?" Deleting that too. Then locking the phone aggressively like he's angry at himself for even trying. People don't talk enough about how emotionally embarrassing vulnerability can feel for avoidant men. Especially after they created distance themselves. Because now reaching out feels exposing. Now there's pride involved, ego involved, fear involved. What if she feels different now? What if she moved on emotionally while he was trying to figure himself out? What if the silence changed something permanently? So instead of reaching directly, he hovers emotionally nearby, watching stories, checking activity, noticing when she's online, looking for connection without risking rejection. And honestly, some nights he hates himself for it. Because deep down he knows If he misses her this much, why is he still hiding? But emotional self-protection is rarely logical, especially when intimacy activated old fears he still doesn't fully understand. So instead of honesty, he stays emotionally halfway hidden, and the loneliness deepens quietly. Not all at once, gradually, like realizing nobody really knows what's happening inside him right now. Friends ask, "You good?" And he automatically says, "Yeah, just tired." Because explaining emotional confusion feels impossible when he barely understands it himself. That's another painful truth about emotionally avoidant people. Sometimes they genuinely cannot organize their feelings into language fast enough. They feel everything physically first. The heaviness, the restlessness, the ache, the absence. But translating that into emotional honesty, that feels terrifyingly exposed. So instead he becomes quieter. Not peaceful quiet, emotionally crowded quiet. The kind where his mind never fully shuts off anymore, especially at night. Nights become dangerous during this phase, because nighttime removes performance. No distractions left, no tasks left, no movement left, just him, and all the emotions he tried to outrun with distance. And memory becomes sharper in silence. That's what hurts. He remembers details now, tiny details he barely noticed while they were happening. The way she looked at him during pauses, the softness in her voice when she got tired, the small concern in her face when he emotionally shut down. And suddenly moments he brushed past emotionally start replaying with painful clarity. That's usually when regret quietly begins forming. Not fully yet, just hints of it. Like realizing he felt safest emotionally around her right when he started pulling away. That contradiction bothers him deeply, because it exposes something uncomfortable. He didn't leave because he felt nothing. He left because he felt too much and didn't know how to regulate it. And once that realization enters, the loneliness changes shape. Now it's not just absence, it's self-awareness. Awareness of how much energy he spent trying to maintain emotional control. Awareness of how often he chose distance instead of honesty. Awareness that maybe she wasn't asking for perfection, just emotional presence. And for some reason, that realization hurts more than criticism would have. Because now he starts seeing the relationship differently. Not through defensiveness, through memory. And memory becomes brutal once emotional clarity starts arriving late. He remembers moments where she reached for him emotionally and he gave her half responses. Moments where she was trying to understand him while he kept hiding behind "I'm fine." And what's tragic is, sometimes he only understands her emotional experience after the distance creates enough silence for reflection. That happens a lot actually. People often recognize emotional safety only after losing access to it. And the deeper the silence gets, the more his body starts craving what his mind tried to escape. Her presence, her attention, her emotional warmth, even the ordinary routines around her, especially the ordinary parts. That's what surprises him most. Not the dramatic memories, the mundane ones. Standing in the kitchen together, her sitting quietly next to him while both of them scrolled their phones. The way she'd ask if he ate yet, the random voice notes, the small emotional consistency he barely appreciated in real time. Now, all those tiny moments feel enormous in retrospect. And somewhere during this phase, he starts confronting a truth that destabilizes him emotionally. Distance did not reduce the feeling. It removed the distraction from it. That's why the silence became unbearable eventually. Because without constant interaction, there's nothing left but emotional reality. And emotional reality says something his pride still struggles to admit. He misses her. Not abstractly, not romantically in some dramatic movie way. Humanly, he misses her presence inside his routines, inside his nervous system, inside the emotional structure of his ordinary life. And the worst part, he created the distance himself, which means now he has to sit with another uncomfortable feeling too. Responsibility. Responsibility for the silence. Responsibility for the confusion. Responsibility for pulling away instead of explaining what was happening internally. That realization humbles him quietly. Not instantly, but enough to crack something open. Because eventually the silence forces him to confront what avoidance was protecting him from all along. He wasn't afraid of losing freedom. He was afraid of needing someone emotionally. And now the emptiness is proving that he already does. At some point, the old version of him stops working properly. Not dramatically. It's quieter than that. More confusing. Like trying to wear clothes that technically still fit, but suddenly feel uncomfortable everywhere. That's what happens after the emotional distance settles in long enough. The distractions that used to work start failing him. Not completely at first, just enough to unsettle him. And honestly, that's when the panic underneath everything starts becoming harder to ignore. Because now he's realizing something deeply uncomfortable. The emotional systems he built to protect himself are no longer regulating him the way they used to. Before her, avoidance worked. That's the part people don't understand. It actually worked for a long time. Staying emotionally detached, keeping relationships surface level, leaving before things became too vulnerable. Maintaining control through emotional distance. That strategy probably protected him for years, maybe even decades. And when something protects you long enough, you stop questioning it. You start calling it personality. I just like my space. I'm independent. I don't get attached easily. But now, something feels different. Because for the first time, the old behaviors aren't bringing relief anymore. They're bringing emptiness. And emptiness is harder to romanticize once you've experienced genuine emotional connection. That's the shift. Not enlightenment. Comparison. His nervous system now knows what emotional closeness felt like. So, going back to emotional detachment no longer feels peaceful. It feels hollow. And that realization follows him everywhere, especially in moments where he expected distraction to work, like flirting. That one catches him off guard, because he assumed attention from someone else would reset him emotionally. Usually it did. Usually validation worked. Usually attraction worked. Usually novelty worked. But now, something feels emotionally absent inside those interactions. He notices it immediately. He's laughing, but not really present. Responding, but emotionally disconnected. Watching someone attractive talk to him while part of his brain drifts somewhere else entirely. And the strangest part is, he almost feels irritated by the interaction. Not because the other person did anything wrong, because the experience feels emotionally thin now. That realization unsettles him deeply, because it exposes how much the connection with her affected his emotional baseline. And suddenly the identity of I can move on easily starts cracking. Quietly, painfully, there's a specific kind of loneliness that happens when your old coping mechanisms stop numbing you properly. That's where he is now. And it leaks into ordinary life in ways nobody around him fully notices. Like standing in the shower too long because the silence feels emotionally heavy. Or sitting in parking lots after work scrolling through nothing for 40 minutes. Or replaying old conversations while pretending he's focused on something else. The body keeps returning to her. Not obsessively. Not constantly. Just persistently. Like unfinished emotional business, his nervous system refuses to file away neatly. And he starts realizing something uncomfortable. He misses her most during emotionally mundane moments. Not the dramatic memories. Not the fantasy versions. The ordinary human ones. That's what ruins him. The normality of it. He misses hearing her ask random questions while he drove. Misses the way she'd send pointless little updates during the day. Misses her presence woven into routines he barely appreciated while they were happening. And because those memories are so ordinary, they feel real in a way fantasy never does. That's why they linger. Anybody can romanticize intensity, but missing someone during laundry, during traffic, while standing in the cereal aisle, that kind of attachment feels terrifyingly genuine. And the worst part is, his ego keeps trying to fight it. Still, even now, you're overthinking. You just got attached temporarily. You'll get over it. Maybe. But if that's true, why does every distraction feel emotionally incomplete afterward? Why does he still instinctively reach for his phone when something happens during the day? Why does silence suddenly feel heavier than freedom? That's the internal collapse happening here. The identity he built around emotional self-sufficiency starts malfunctioning under the weight of real attachment. And honestly, it makes him emotionally reactive in weird ways. That's another thing people misunderstand. When emotionally avoidant men start feeling destabilized internally, they don't always become soft immediately. Sometimes they become irritated first, moodier, shorter-tempered, emotionally distant in confusing ways. Not because they stop caring, because emotional suppression consumes energy, and exhaustion changes people. So now little things affect him more. He gets frustrated faster, withdraws mid-conversation, feels overstimulated by emotional demands he used to handle more easily. And part of him notices the shift. That's what makes this stage psychologically brutal. He's aware enough to recognize he's changing, but not emotionally skilled enough yet to fully process why. So he starts trying to analyze himself. Late-night self-interrogation. The kind that happens when someone's sitting alone in dim lighting pretending they're not thinking about someone. Why can't I let this go? No answer. Then another voice quietly responds, because you actually cared. And immediately he resists it. No, that's not it. Then what is it? Silence. That kind of silence. The uncomfortable internal silence where the truth is obvious, but emotionally inconvenient. And eventually another realization starts forming underneath everything. It wasn't just her presence he got attached to. It was how he felt around her. That's what destabilizes him most. Because she disrupted something deeper than attraction. She disrupted emotional numbness. And once numbness breaks, you start feeling everything else too. Loneliness, fear, need, regret, longing, emotional exhaustion. All the things distraction used to keep buried successfully. That's why his old identity starts malfunctioning. Because emotionally detached personas often rely on not feeling too deeply. But now depth entered the system. Now emotional stakes exist. And suddenly the version of him that could stay emotionally unaffected no longer feels authentic. That realization creates grief too. Quiet grief. The grief of realizing how disconnected he's actually been from himself for years. And sometimes he starts recognizing it in embarrassing little moments. Like realizing he doesn't actually enjoy going out as much as he pretended to. Or sitting with friends laughing while feeling emotionally upset underneath it. Or noticing how empty casual interactions feel now that he's experienced emotional intimacy that actually touched him. That comparison changes people, especially men who spent years surviving through emotional surface-level living. Because once you experience emotional depth, performative detachment becomes harder to tolerate internally, even if you still perform it externally. And this is where the contradictions intensify. Because part of him still wants to run, still wants escape, still wants emotional simplicity again. But another part knows something irreversible already happened internally. He can't unknow what he felt, can't unfeel the emotional safety, can't erase the vulnerability, can't fully return to being untouched. That awareness creates tension inside everything now. Even his routines feel emotionally different. Music hits differently. Driving feels different. Coming home feels different. Especially coming home. People underestimate how emotionally loud an apartment becomes once someone meaningful emotionally disappears from your daily rhythm. The silence changes texture somehow, and suddenly he notices things he never paid attention to before. The empty side of the couch, the lack of notifications from her, how nobody asks if he made it home safely anymore. Tiny absences, tiny emotional withdrawals from ordinary life. And somehow those hurt more than dramatic endings, because they expose how deeply integrated someone became emotionally without him consciously realizing it while it was happening. That realization humbles him, slowly, painfully, and the most difficult part is, he starts understanding that the issue isn't really her. Not entirely. She didn't cause this emotional collapse. She exposed one that was already quietly there underneath his coping mechanisms. That's why nothing external fixes it now. Not attention, not distractions, not distance. Because the real problem isn't missing her anymore. It's confronting the emptiness he was using emotional detachment to avoid long before she entered his life. And once that realization enters, his old identity starts breaking down faster. The emotionally untouchable version of himself. The version that never needed anyone. The version that could always leave first without consequences. That version is becoming harder to believe now. Even for him. Especially for him. And honestly, that's usually the beginning of real change. Not because he suddenly becomes emotionally healed overnight, but because the performance finally stops feeling convincing internally. The mask still exists externally, but underneath it, he's starting to realize he's lonelier, softer, more emotionally affected, and far more human than he ever allowed himself to admit before. What nobody really talks about is the anger. Not loud anger necessarily. Sometimes it's quieter than that. More personal. The kind that turns inward. Because somewhere during all of this, after the longing, after the confusion, after the emotional distance stops working properly, he starts resenting how deeply this feeling affects him. And honestly, that resentment can make him colder for a while. Not because the love disappears, because the loss of control starts terrifying him. That's the contradiction people misunderstand constantly. They assume emotional withdrawal means emotional absence. Sometimes withdrawal is actually emotional overload mixed with shame. Because now he's confronting something his identity was never built to handle well. Dependency. Not practical dependency. Emotional dependency. The realization that one person can alter the emotional atmosphere of his entire day without even being physically present. That realization destabilizes him more than heartbreak itself sometimes, because it forces him to confront how little control he actually has over his inner world now. And he hates that. He hates checking his phone more than he wants to. Hates thinking about her during random moments. Hates that certain songs suddenly feel emotionally dangerous now. Most of all, he hates that he can't simply shut the feeling off. That's usually where masculine shame enters the story heavily, because many men are conditioned to associate emotional self-control with strength. So, when attachment starts affecting them deeply, they don't just feel vulnerable, they feel weak for being vulnerable. And those are two very different emotional experiences. Vulnerability says, I care. Shame says, I shouldn't. That second voice creates enormous internal conflict, especially for emotionally avoidant men. So now he's split internally between tenderness and resistance. One part of him misses her deeply. Another part feels angry that he misses her at all. And because he doesn't fully understand how to process emotional dependence safely, the anger often surfaces first. Not dramatic rage, subtle coldness, irritation, emotional withdrawal, short responses, distance that feels emotionally confusing from the outside. Sometimes he even becomes colder precisely when he feels most attached. That's the painful irony. The deeper the feeling gets, the more emotionally trapped he starts feeling by it. And trapped people often react by pulling away harder, even from what they love, especially from what they love. Because intimacy now carries emotional consequences he can't avoid anymore. That awareness changes everything. Now every interaction feels loaded. Every silence feels loaded. Every delayed reply feels loaded. And internally, he starts asking himself uncomfortable questions. When did this become so serious? No answer. Then another thought quietly follows. When did she start mattering this much? That one sits heavier, because he genuinely doesn't know exactly when it happened. Attachment rarely announces itself clearly while it's forming. It accumulates through repetition, through routines, through emotional safety, through tiny, ordinary moments that don't look important until they're gone. And now, suddenly, he realizes her presence exists inside his nervous system in a way he didn't consent to consciously. That realization feels violating almost. Not because she did anything wrong, because emotional attachment bypassed his control mechanisms completely. That loss of control creates resentment, not necessarily toward her directly, toward himself, toward his own emotional softness, toward his own need, toward the terrifying realization that he's far more emotionally human than he pretended to be. And honestly, some men become emotionally harsher during this phase because they're trying desperately to regain psychological control. So now he starts intellectualizing everything, trying to reduce the emotional experience into logic. Maybe I'm just lonely. Maybe I'm idealizing her. Maybe this is just attachment, as if finding the correct explanation will make the feeling less real. But explanations rarely calm the nervous system once emotional significance has already rooted itself deeply. That's why the body keeps betraying him, even while his mind argues against the attachment. Like hearing her name unexpectedly and immediately feeling tension in his chest, or seeing her online and pretending not to care, while noticing his mood shift anyway. Those involuntary reactions frustrate him deeply, because they expose truth faster than his pride can suppress it. And pride becomes a major character during this stage, especially wounded masculine pride, because now he's forced to confront something emotionally humiliating. He is affected, deeply affected, not casually, not temporarily, not in the detached, controlled way he originally imagined. And for someone who built emotional identity around self-sufficiency, that realization can feel almost unbearable. So naturally, he starts trying to reclaim emotional power, sometimes through distance, sometimes through silence, sometimes through emotional withholding, not always consciously manipulative, sometimes instinctive. A nervous system trying to reduce vulnerability by reducing access. But what makes this stage tragic is the behaviors meant to restore emotional control often deepen the loneliness underneath everything. So now he's colder externally, while internally becoming more emotionally consumed. That contradiction exhausts him, especially late at night. Nights become psychologically brutal here, because this is the stage where the internal arguments intensify. The private conversations nobody hears. The emotionally embarrassing ones. You need to let this go. Then why can't you? I don't know. She's affecting your peace. She became part of it. Silence. That kind of silence. The kind where he stares at the ceiling feeling emotionally exposed by his own honesty. And sometimes the resentment turns outward briefly too. That's another uncomfortable truth. Occasionally, he resents her for reaching emotional places inside him he's spent years protecting. Even if she did it gently. Even if she loved him carefully. Because once emotional walls crack open, everything underneath starts surfacing. Fear, need, grief, longing, loneliness. And emotionally avoidant men often experience those feelings as overwhelming instead of comforting initially. That's why intimacy can trigger panic instead of peace, especially if emotional closeness was historically associated with instability, criticism, abandonment, or loss. So now part of him wants her desperately, while another part associates needing her with danger. That contradiction creates emotional paralysis. And paralysis often looks like mixed signals from the outside. Hot and cold behavior. Moments of softness followed by sudden withdrawal. Intimacy followed by emotional disappearance. Not because the emotions aren't real. Because the emotions are too real. That's the part people rarely understand correctly. Sometimes emotionally unavailable behavior comes from emotional flooding, not emotional emptiness. And unfortunately, he may not communicate any of this clearly while it's happening. Because clarity requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires surrender. And surrender feels emotionally unsafe to him still. So instead, he becomes harder to read. More emotionally guarded. More controlled. More detached externally. Meanwhile, internally, he's replaying memories constantly, especially the small ones. The look she gave him when he emotionally shut down. The softness in her voice during vulnerable conversations. The moments she tried to reassure him while he pretended not to need reassurance. Those memories haunt him because now he recognizes what she was offering emotionally. Presence. Consistency, emotional patience, care without performance, and instead of fully relaxing into it, he fought it. That realization creates guilt too. Quiet guilt, the kind that sits in the chest while brushing your teeth at midnight, the kind that appears randomly during traffic lights, the kind that whispers, "You hurt someone who was trying to love you carefully." That thought destabilizes him emotionally, because underneath all the avoidance, all the distance, all the emotional confusion, he usually never wanted to become the source of pain. But fear makes people behave in contradictory ways. Sometimes they hurt what they most want to keep, not maliciously, protectively, desperately. And eventually, he starts recognizing the deeper truth underneath his resentment. He doesn't actually hate the feeling. He hates how powerless it makes him feel. That distinction matters. Because the issue was never emotional connection itself. The issue was what emotional connection exposed. His dependence. His fear. His softness. His longing. His humanity. All the things he spent years trying to control tightly. And now control is slipping. Not fully, but enough. Enough to make him realize the emotionally detached version of himself was never as invincible as he pretended. Enough to make him confront how exhausted he is from constantly managing vulnerability instead of living honestly. enough to make the loneliness start feeling heavier than the risk of emotional openness. And somewhere underneath all the resistance, something inside him quietly begins softening too. Not perfectly, not consistently, but enough for him to finally start asking a question he avoided from the beginning. What if the feeling isn't the problem? That question terrifies him, because if the feeling itself isn't the enemy, then eventually he'll have to confront the real thing he's been fighting all along. The fear of being truly emotionally seen and needing someone after all. Eventually, the noise gets too loud to outrun. Not external noise, internal noise. Because after enough distance, enough silence, enough pretending, the split inside him starts becoming impossible to ignore. That's when the private conversations begin. The real ones. Not the polished explanations he gives other people. Not the emotionally safe versions. The ugly, unfinished, late-night arguments happening entirely inside his own head. Usually when he's alone. Usually when there's finally nothing left to distract him. That's the dangerous part about emotional silence. At first, it protects you. Then eventually it corners you. And now he's cornered by his own thoughts. Not constantly. That's important. People imagine emotional realization as one giant breakthrough moment. Most of the time it's smaller than that. Messier. He'll be okay for most of the day. Then suddenly it hits him while doing something painfully ordinary. Driving home. Folding clothes. Standing in the kitchen at midnight drinking water straight from the sink because he's too mentally exhausted to grab a glass. And out of nowhere, her memory enters the room again. Not even a dramatic memory. That's what destroys him most. The small ones. The stupidly specific ones. The way she used to pause before answering serious questions. The way she'd say his name softly when she could tell he was emotionally leaving the conversation. The look on her face when he'd pretend he was fine too quickly. Tiny moments. Moments he barely reacted to in real time. Now they replay with surgical precision. And this is usually where he starts realizing something emotionally devastating. He understood her more after the distance than while she was actually there. That realization hurts in a very specific way. Because now he sees things differently. Now he notices where she was trying to reach him emotionally. Where she gave him opportunities to open up. Where she stayed patient while he stayed guarded. And instead of receiving it fully, he kept managing the closeness. Reducing it. Controlling it. Escaping it halfway. That truth starts becoming harder to avoid now. So the internal dialogues intensify. The strange thing is, they rarely sound profound. They sound human, messy, embarrassingly honest sometimes. Like sitting in the dark with his phone in his hand thinking, just move on. Then another voice quietly answers, then why haven't you? Silence. Then frustration. I don't know. But he does know. Partially. He just doesn't like the answer. Because the answer forces him to confront how emotionally attached he actually became. And attachment changes memory. That's another thing nobody warns you about. Distance sharpens emotional detail. Now he remembers moments he ignored before. Like the night she asked, "Why do you always pull away when things get real?" And he laughed it off, made some sarcastic comment, changed the subject, kissed her instead of answering. At the time, it felt harmless. Now it replays differently. Now he sees the sadness hidden underneath her smile afterward. Now he notices the emotional exhaustion she was carrying quietly. That's what private reflection does. It removes defensiveness from memory. And once defensiveness weakens, clarity becomes brutal. So now he starts confronting truths about himself he's spent years avoiding successfully. not spiritual truths, psychological ones. Like how uncomfortable he becomes when someone genuinely cares about him consistently. How quickly he withdraws when intimacy stops feeling casual. How often he confuses emotional independence with emotional isolation. That realization shakes him more than losing her sometimes. Because now the issue is no longer just the relationship. Now the issue is him, his patterns, his reflexes, his fear. And honestly, that's terrifying. Because relationships ending can be blamed on timing, circumstances, compatibility, but recognizing your own emotional unavailability, that follows you everywhere. Now, there's nowhere to place the responsibility except inward. And internally, the arguments continue. She deserved better communication. I know. So why didn't you give it to her? I was trying. Were you? That question lingers. Because part of him genuinely was trying. That's the tragedy. He wasn't emotionless. He was overwhelmed, confused, protective, afraid of losing control over himself. But intentions don't erase impact. And somewhere during these late-night conversations, he starts realizing that. He starts understanding how emotionally lonely she probably felt standing next to someone who cared deeply but struggled to show it consistently. That realization creates grief. Real grief. Not just grief over losing her. Grief over how much emotional intimacy he sabotaged while simultaneously craving it. And the body reacts to these realizations too. People underestimate how physical regret feels. The heaviness in the chest, the sudden exhaustion, the restless pacing around the apartment, the inability to fully focus on anything for long. Sometimes he sits down to watch something and realizes 20 minutes passed without him absorbing any of it. Because internally he's somewhere else. Back inside memories. Back inside unfinished conversations. Back inside moments he wishes he handled differently. And the worst memories are rarely dramatic fights. They're subtle moments where he now realizes she was emotionally reaching for him. Like her asking, "Can you just be honest with me for once?" And him immediately becoming defensive. Or her going quiet after he emotionally shut down again. Or the way she sometimes looked at him like she was trying to understand whether he was scared or simply uninterested. That one destroys him later. Because now he knows the answer. He was scared. Terrified actually. Not of her. Of what being fully loved by someone emotionally safe would require from him internally. Consistency. Honesty. Vulnerability. Presence. Those things sound simple until you've spent years surviving through emotional self-protection. And now, he's forced to confront another painful truth. He kept waiting to feel emotionally ready, while slowly hurting someone who was trying to love him in the present. That realization changes the internal dialogue again. Now it's less defensive, more regretful. And regret has a very particular emotional texture when it arrives late. Especially for men, because men are often socialized to suppress emotional processing until distance forces reflection. So now the emotions arrive all at once. The longing, the guilt, the tenderness, the shame, the awareness. And some nights he genuinely doesn't know what to do with all of it. That's when the really raw internal conversations happen. The ones nobody hears. The ones he'd never admit out loud. Like staring at her contact name in his phone thinking, just text her, then immediately. And say what? The truth. I don't even fully understand the truth yet. That's honest. Painfully honest. Because emotional realization is rarely clean while it's happening. People want clarity too quickly. But internally, he's still untangling years of emotional conditioning in real time. still trying to understand why intimacy activated fear instead of peace. Why being emotionally cared for made him want to run sometimes. Why silence now hurts worse than vulnerability did. And somewhere in the middle of all these private conversations, another realization slowly forms. One he resists heavily at first. He didn't actually want distance from her. He wanted distance from the emotional exposure she created inside him. That distinction changes everything. Because now he understands. The problem was never simply the relationship. The relationship revealed and resolved parts of himself he could no longer ignore afterward. That's why he can't go back to normal fully now. Because normal was emotional suppression. Normal was disconnection. Normal was staying untouched. Normal was avoiding depth before it became destabilizing. But once someone reaches you emotionally in a real way, you become aware of your own emptiness differently afterward. And awareness is irreversible. That's the painful gift of emotional connection. Even if the relationship pauses, even if distance exists, even if silence stretches between them, he cannot unknow himself now, cannot unknow how much he actually felt, cannot unknow how lonely emotional detachment truly was, cannot unknow how deeply her presence affected him beneath the surface. And the more honest these internal conversations become, the less convincing his old identity feels. The detached one, the emotionally untouchable one, the version of himself that claimed he didn't really need anyone. That version is collapsing quietly now. Not all at once, but enough. Enough for him to finally admit something to himself during one exhausted late-night moment sitting alone in the dark. I think I was loved more honestly than I knew how to receive. And after that realization, the silence inside him changes forever. Regret almost never arrives dramatically. That's what people get wrong. It doesn't usually enter the room like a movie scene where someone suddenly realizes everything all at once. Most of the time, it arrives quietly, in pieces, late. And honestly, that's what makes it hurt so much. Because by the time he fully understands what he lost emotionally, the moment to protect it may already feel far away. That realization settles into him slowly, like exhaustion, like finally seeing something clearly after spending months emotionally squinting at it. And the strange thing is, regret doesn't begin with the big memories. It begins with the small ones. Always the small ones. That's what breaks him open eventually. Not the intense conversations. Not the dramatic moments. Not even the fights. The ordinary things. The things he barely noticed while they were happening. Like hearing a joke during the day and instinctively reaching for his phone to send it to her, before remembering the distance between them. That split second hurts. Not because of the phone, because muscle memory exposes attachment faster than pride can hide it. And now, these moments start happening constantly. Tiny emotional collisions with absence. Walking into a coffee shop and remembering exactly what she used to order. Seeing something in a store she would have laughed at. Hearing a phrase she used often and feeling his stomach tighten unexpectedly. Ordinary life becomes emotionally haunted in very quiet ways. And he starts realizing how deeply she existed inside his routines. Not just his emotions. His routines. That realization feels devastatingly real. Because fantasy is easy to dismiss. But when someone exists inside your everyday life psychologically, that's different. That's attachment. And attachment becomes painfully visible through absence. That's why regret often arrives through repetition, not intensity. The repeated realization that she became part of his inner world in ways he never acknowledged properly while she was there. And now memory sharpens everything. That's the cruel part. Distance removes emotional defensiveness. So moments replay differently now, more honestly. Like remembering the times she tried to communicate directly with him emotionally. Not aggressively, not manipulatively, just honestly. And now, he hears those conversations differently in his head. He remembers her asking, "Why do I feel like you're here physically, but emotionally somewhere else sometimes?" At the time, he got defensive. Told her she was overthinking. Told her he was just stressed. Told her nothing was wrong. Now, he realizes she was describing his emotional unavailability with painful accuracy. That realization creates a very specific kind of regret. Because now he understands she wasn't demanding perfection. She was asking for emotional presence. And for some reason, that terrified him more than losing her did at the time. That's the truth he struggles to sit with. Because now he sees how many moments she gave him opportunities to be emotionally honest, and how many times he avoided them. Not maliciously, protectively, instinctively. Still, avoidance leaves consequences behind, and eventually he has to face them internally. That's why regret starts showing up in strange private moments, like rereading old messages late at night. Not even intentionally sometimes. Just opening the conversation absent-mindedly, scrolling upward slowly, and suddenly noticing emotional details he overlooked before. The effort in her words, the patience, the way she kept trying to understand him even when he gave her almost nothing emotionally to work with. That realization sits heavy, because now he's seeing the relationship through her emotional experience too. And honestly, that perspective hurts him more than loneliness sometimes, because loneliness can still protect the ego slightly, but empathy destroys defensiveness. And now, he's realizing how emotionally confusing his behavior probably felt from her side. How she likely felt him care, while simultaneously feeling him hold back. That inconsistency creates pain. He sees that now. Too late maybe, but clearly. And clarity arriving late has a very particular emotional ache attached to it, especially for men who process emotions slowly. That's another thing people rarely talk about honestly. Some men don't emotionally understand the weight of the relationship until distance removes the distractions around it. Not because they never cared, because emotional processing was delayed by survival patterns, distraction, work, avoidance, control. But eventually silence catches up to everyone. And once it does, the emotions start organizing themselves differently. Now he notices patterns. The way he pulled away every time things became emotionally deeper. The way he hid vulnerability behind humor or logic. The way he waited for her to reassure him emotionally while pretending not to need reassurance at all. That last one embarrasses him deeply, because now he recognizes how emotionally contradictory he actually was. Wanting closeness while resisting it. Wanting love while distrusting it. Wanting her to stay while emotionally withholding enough to make staying painful. And honestly, that realization humbles him. Painfully, there is a specific kind of maturity that comes from finally seeing your own emotional patterns clearly after they already cost you something meaningful. That's where he is now. Not healed, not transformed overnight, just confronted. Confronted by himself. And some nights the regret becomes almost physical. Like sitting on the edge of the bed staring at nothing while old memories replay automatically. The night she looked exhausted after trying to communicate with him for hours. The moment she asked, "Why does loving you feel lonely sometimes?" That sentence follows him for weeks afterward. Because at the time, he didn't fully understand it. Now he does. Now he realizes emotional absence can exist even when someone is physically present. And recognizing that about himself breaks something open internally. Not dramatically. Quietly. The kind of quiet where someone suddenly becomes softer without anybody else noticing immediately. And the painful irony is, he often becomes emotionally ready after the relationship already destabilized. That happens more than people admit. Some men require distance before self-awareness fully arrives. Not because distance heals them magically, because distance removes emotional noise long enough for reflection to finally happen. And reflection changes memory. Now, he remembers how often she gave him grace. How often she tried to stay emotionally patient. How many chances she gave him to simply tell the truth. Not a perfect truth, just an honest one. I'm scared. I don't know how to do this. I care more than I'm showing. That's all she probably wanted. Not perfection. Honesty. But honesty felt emotionally dangerous to him back then. So instead he gave partial truths. Half vulnerability. Half presence. Half communication. And eventually half love exhausts people emotionally. He understands that now. And understanding it creates grief. Not performative grief. Private grief. The kind that appears in ordinary moments. Like driving home at night and suddenly feeling emotionally overwhelmed by a memory so small it almost sounds ridiculous. Her fixing his hoodie collar absent-mindedly. Her asking if he slept okay. Her waiting for him to open up even after he emotionally shut down again. Tiny moments. That's what destroys him. Because now he realizes. Those moments were love. Not the dramatic highs. The consistency. The care. The emotional patience. And he was too emotionally defended to fully receive it in real time. That realization changes the internal dialogue again. Now the voice inside him sounds less defensive, less angry, sadder. You loved her. Silence. Then finally, I think I did. Not performative, not poetic, just tired honesty. And once he admits that to himself, another truth follows immediately after. She loved you too. That realization hurts differently, because now he has to confront what he did with that love once he received it. How often he doubted it, questioned it, pulled away from it. How many times he made someone emotionally safe feel emotionally uncertain instead. That awareness creates guilt he can no longer fully escape through distraction. And the hardest part is, he knows she probably felt his love underneath everything. That's what makes it tragic. The care was there. The fear was there too. And fear kept interrupting the expression of love consistently. Now, he understands that emotional intention means very little if behavior keeps creating emotional confusion. That truth matures him quietly. Not perfectly. Not instantly. But enough. Enough for him to stop romanticizing his avoidance. Enough to stop calling emotional distance independence. Enough to finally recognize how much emotional labor she carried trying to understand someone who barely understood himself yet. And somewhere in the middle of all this regret, something softens inside him completely for the first time. Not his ego, his defenses. Because regret eventually strips away performance. It leaves only truth. And the truth is painfully simple now. She wasn't asking him to become someone else. She was asking him to stop disappearing emotionally every time love became real. And now, sitting alone with all the silence he once thought he wanted, he finally understands the difference. From the outside, it looks sudden. That's what everyone notices first. The shift, the softening, the honesty, the strange emotional openness that seems to appear overnight. People see the behavior change and assume the realization happened instantly. But internally, nothing about it was instant. It was accumulation. Weeks of emotional noise. Weeks of silence that stopped feeling peaceful. Weeks of replaying memories while pretending not to care. Weeks of his nervous system fighting truths his ego kept delaying. That's what people don't see. The overnight change usually comes after months of internal resistance, after exhaustion, after avoidance stops protecting him emotionally. And honestly, by the time the external change becomes visible, he's already been emotionally unraveling privately for a long time. That's why when it finally surfaces outwardly, it almost surprises everyone around him. Even her sometimes. Especially her. Because she remembers the colder version. The emotionally guarded version. The version that struggled to say what he felt directly. The version that kept disappearing emotionally whenever things became vulnerable. So when he suddenly becomes softer, it feels confusing. But internally, he knows the softness didn't appear magically. It was built slowly through loss, reflection, regret, loneliness, and the terrifying experience of finally meeting himself honestly. That's the real shift. Not becoming a new person, becoming unable to keep pretending. And the change first appears in very subtle ways. Not grand romantic speeches. Tiny things. He starts answering differently, listening differently, pausing before reacting defensively. There's less performance in him now, less emotional armor. Not because he mastered vulnerability perfectly, because he got tired. That's the truth nobody romanticizes enough. Emotional exhaustion softens people sometimes, especially men who spend years fighting their own feelings internally. Eventually, the constant self-protection becomes heavier than honesty. And somewhere during all the silence, he realizes he doesn't actually want to keep living emotionally half-present anymore. That realization changes his energy before it changes his words. People can feel it. He becomes quieter, but calmer quieter, not withdrawn quieter. The frantic emotional resistance starts fading. Not completely, but enough. Enough for him to finally sit still with his own feelings without immediately trying to escape them. That's huge for someone emotionally avoidant. Now, he can actually admit things internally without panicking instantly afterward. Like, I miss her. Simple sentence. But for him, that sentence used to feel emotionally dangerous. Now it just feels true. And truth changes the nervous system slowly. That's why his behavior starts shifting naturally afterward. He stops trying so hard to look unaffected. That performance becomes exhausting now. He notices how often he used sarcasm to avoid vulnerability. How often he pretended confusion when he actually understood the emotional issue clearly. How often he delayed emotional honesty hoping feelings would disappear on their own. They never did. That realization humbles him. And humility changes people quietly. Now conversations feel different around him. Less reactive. Less emotionally slippery. He starts saying things more directly. Not perfectly. Still awkward sometimes. Still hesitant. But more honest. Like catching himself before giving another emotionally detached response and instead saying, I don't really know how to explain this properly yet. That sentence matters. Because emotionally avoidant men often hide behind certainty. Honesty about confusion requires vulnerability. And vulnerability no longer feels quite as unbearable now. Not comfortable. Just survivable. That's progress. Real progress is usually less dramatic than people expect. It's often just someone finally stopping their own emotional disappearing acts. And honestly, he still struggles sometimes during this phase. That's important. The change is real, but inconsistent. One day he feels emotionally open. The next day fear creeps back in again. Healing isn't linear. Self-awareness isn't linear. especially for people learning emotional honesty later in life. So there are still moments where he retreats internally. Still moments where he stares at a message too long before answering. Still moments where intimacy activates panic briefly. But now he notices himself doing it. That awareness changes everything. Because before, avoidance felt automatic. Now it feels sad. That's the difference. Now, when he withdraws emotionally, part of him immediately recognizes the pattern. Recognizes the fear. Recognizes the impulse to self-protect. Recognizes how easily he used to sabotage closeness without questioning it. That self-awareness creates gentleness in him. Not performative gentleness. Human gentleness. The kind born from finally understanding how much loneliness his emotional defenses created. And strangely, he becomes more emotionally available in ordinary moments first, not dramatic ones. He starts checking in more naturally, listening more carefully, staying emotionally present during difficult conversations instead of escaping them immediately. Tiny things. But tiny things are what relationships are built from. That's what he understands now. Love was never only the intense moments. It was consistency, presence, emotional honesty during ordinary life. And he finally sees how much emotional labor she carried trying to hold closeness together while he kept panicking internally. That realization changes the way he remembers her too. Before, he mostly focused on how overwhelmed he felt. Now, he starts seeing her emotional experience more clearly. How patient she was. How often she tried to understand him instead of attack him. How many times she reached toward him emotionally while he stood frozen inside himself. That memory hurts differently now. Softer, less defensive. And sometimes he feels grief when he realizes how much love he received while being emotionally unable to fully receive it. That grief matures him. Quietly. Now, he notices emotionally performative behavior in himself more quickly. The urge to act unaffected. The urge to delay responses strategically. The urge to pretend he needs less than he actually does emotionally. Those habits start feeling childish to him now. Not shameful exactly, just sad. Because he finally understands what those defenses were costing him. Connection, intimacy, peace, and eventually another change becomes visible too. He stops romanticizing emotional distance. That's huge. Because for years he probably mistook emotional suppression for strength. Thought detachment meant maturity. Thought needing nobody meant freedom. Now, he sees the loneliness underneath it. Sees how disconnected he actually was from himself. And honestly, some people around him may not even recognize the change immediately because externally he still looks similar. Still goes to work. Still jokes around. Still functions normally. But internally, something fundamental shifted. He's softer with himself now. That matters more than people realize. Because self-awareness without self-compassion usually just creates shame. But eventually he starts understanding. He wasn't emotionally difficult because he was broken beyond repair. He was scared. Scared of dependence. Scared of vulnerability. Scared of needing someone enough to be heard by losing them. And once he admits that honestly, his anger starts dissolving too. Now, there's less emotional fighting happening inside him. Less resistance. Less internal war. Not total peace. Just less violence toward his own feelings. And ironically, that's often when he finally becomes emotionally safer to love. Not because he became perfect. Because he stopped running from himself constantly. That changes how he shows up. Now, he can sit inside emotional conversations longer without shutting down completely. Now, he can admit uncertainty instead of hiding behind distance. Now he can say, "I care about you," without immediately feeling trapped afterward. That's massive growth for someone who once associated emotional closeness with loss of control. And maybe the most important shift of all is this: he stops trying to win against the feeling. For months, he treated his emotions like enemies, something to suppress, control, escape. Now he understands the feeling was never attacking him. It was revealing him, revealing his loneliness, his longing, his capacity for love, his fear of vulnerability, his exhaustion from performing emotional independence constantly. That awareness changes his entire emotional posture toward life. And eventually, people around him start saying things like, "You seem different lately," and he doesn't fully know how to explain it. Because how do you explain the slow collapse of an emotional identity you spent years building? How do you explain finally realizing that detachment wasn't protecting your peace? It was protecting your fear? You can't summarize that transformation neatly, especially not when it happened through sleepless nights, missed chances, silence, regret, and finally telling the truth to yourself in the dark when nobody else was around to hear it. So instead, he just shrugs a little, says, "I've been thinking a lot lately," but internally he knows the truth is much deeper than that. The overnight change everyone suddenly sees was actually built from hundreds of quiet moments where he finally stopped abandoning his own emotions every time they became real. This is usually the part people want to turn into a clean ending, a satisfying one. The moment where he finally reaches out, says all the right things, becomes emotionally available overnight, and love fixes everything neatly. But real life rarely moves like that. Real emotional change is messier, slower, incomplete sometimes. And honestly, not every man comes back the way people hope he will. That's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. Because emotional realization and emotional courage are not the same thing. A man can fully understand how much someone meant to him, and still struggle to express it. He can become deeply self-aware, and still freeze when it's finally time to be vulnerable out loud. That contradiction exists more often than people admit, especially for men who spent most of their lives surviving emotionally instead of communicating emotionally. So, by the end of all this, there are usually two battles happening inside him at once. The first battle is emotional truth. That part is mostly settled now. He knows he cared, knows he loved her in his own imperfect way, knows the connection changed him. The second battle is harder, action, because feeling something deeply and expressing it consistently are two completely different skills. And some men learn that too late. That's why some of them come back softer, but still awkward, still imperfect, still emotionally clumsy. The difference is, now the clumsiness contains honesty instead of avoidance. That matters, because before, his silence came from fear disguised as detachment. Now, if he hesitates, he at least understands why. That self-awareness changes the emotional energy around him. He becomes less performative, less defensive, less emotionally slippery, but still human, still uncertain sometimes, still capable of fear. And honestly, that's what makes the transformation believable. Not perfection, humanity. The way he now pauses before shutting down emotionally. The way he catches himself mid-withdrawal. The way he finally admits things without needing to sound emotionally invincible first. Sometimes the change appears in very small moments, like finally sending the text he avoided for months. Not a perfect speech, just honesty. Something simple like, "I handled things badly. I think I was scared. I cared more than I knew how to show." That kind of message usually takes emotionally avoidant men far more courage than people realize. Because now there's nowhere left to hide inside emotional ambiguity. Now he has to risk rejection honestly. And honesty feels terrifying when someone spent years surviving through emotional control. So yes, some men come back, but not always dramatically. Sometimes quietly. Sometimes with trembling emotional honesty hidden inside very ordinary words. Sometimes after weeks of typing and deleting messages they never sent. That's another thing people don't talk about enough. The amount of unsent honesty that exists inside emotionally guarded people. Entire conversations never spoken. Apologies rehearsed internally for months. Love felt deeply but expressed halfway. And eventually some men reach a point where silence hurts more than vulnerability. That's usually when they finally move. Not because fear disappeared, because regret became heavier. But not everyone reaches that point in time. That's the painful reality too. Some men fully realize everything and still remain emotionally frozen. Not because the love wasn't real, because fear still wins. People underestimate how powerful emotional conditioning can be, especially in men taught from childhood to disconnect from vulnerability quickly. So sometimes he understands the relationship completely only after the distance becomes permanent. That happens more than people admit. He finally becomes emotionally available after she emotionally moved on. He finally learns how to communicate after she stopped waiting. That timing destroys people quietly, especially at night, especially during ordinary moments where the absence still appears unexpectedly, like hearing a song she loved while driving, or finding an old hoodie she left behind, or realizing nobody has asked how his day really was in months. Those moments hit differently once emotional awareness arrives fully, because now there's no emotional defense left to hide behind. Now he understands exactly what he lost. Not fantasy, not obsession, connection. And some men carry that realization for years privately. They function normally, work normally, date other people sometimes. But internally, there's still a version of them sitting alone replaying the moment they almost chose emotional honesty, then didn't. That regret lingers differently when the relationship genuinely changed you. And honestly, people oversimplify emotional growth too much. They act like realization automatically creates transformation. It doesn't. Sometimes realization simply creates grief. Grief over how long someone lived emotionally disconnected from themselves. Grief over how many people they hurt while trying not to get hurt themselves. Grief over how much love they received while lacking the emotional tools to receive it properly. That grief changes people quietly, sometimes beautifully, sometimes tragically, and occasionally, he does come back different. Not smoother, not more charming, just more real, more emotionally transparent, more willing to stay inside difficult conversations instead of escaping them, more capable of saying, "I don't know how to do this perfectly, but I want to try." That sentence matters more than polished emotional speeches sometimes. Because emotionally mature love is often less dramatic than emotionally avoidant love. Less chasing, less confusion, less emotional disappearing, more presence. And presence is what he was truly learning the entire time. Not how to win love, not how to stop feeling, how to remain emotionally present without abandoning himself or the other person. That's the real lesson underneath everything. And honestly, some men never fully master it. Some stay trapped inside emotional avoidance forever, still functioning, still charming, still emotionally half detached from their own lives. But somewhere deep down, they remember the person who almost broke the pattern. The one who reached them emotionally enough to expose the loneliness underneath all the performance. Those connections haunt people quietly, not because they were perfect, because they were real. And real things leave marks. That's why even years later, certain memories still carry emotional weight. Not the dramatic moments, the human ones. Her sitting quietly beside him while both of them were tired. The way she looked at him when he finally told the truth about something painful. The nights she stayed emotionally patient while he struggled against closeness internally. Those moments survive because they touched something authentic underneath all the fear. And once authenticity reaches someone deeply enough, they can never fully return to emotional numbness afterward. That's the irreversible part. Even if the relationship ends, even if they never speak again, even if life moves forward externally, something internally changed. The old, emotionally disconnected identity cracked permanently. And maybe that's what people really mean when they say he changed overnight. Not that he suddenly became someone else, but that eventually the emotional mask became too exhausting to carry anymore. The pretending, the detachment, the performance of not caring too much. At some point, the loneliness underneath all of it became impossible to ignore. And whether he returned or not, whether the relationship survived or not, he was never emotionally the same after confronting that truth honestly. That's the ending people don't always want because it isn't perfectly comforting. Sometimes love changes someone internally, without guaranteeing reconciliation externally. Sometimes the transformation arrives after damage already happened. Sometimes people meet each other at the wrong emotional stage of life. And that reality hurts. But it's human. Very human. Still, there's something quietly beautiful about the fact that someone finally reached him deeply enough to interrupt years of emotional survival patterns. Even if imperfectly, even if painfully, because for the first time in his life, he stopped mistaking emotional detachment for strength. He stopped confusing numbness with peace. He stopped calling loneliness independence. And somewhere in the middle of all the silence, all the regret, all the fear, all the late-night conversations with himself, he finally understood something simple that used to terrify him. Being deeply affected by love was never the weakness. Pretending he wasn't was.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.